Texas carried out its 500th execution tonight since the death penalty resumed here in 1982. Convicted killer Kimberly McCarthy was executed by lethal injection tonight in Huntsville. She is the first woman executed in the U.S. since 2010. McCarthy was convicted of robbing, beating, and stabbing to death retired college psychology professor Dorothy Booth in 1997 in North Texas.
On June 26, 2013, Kimberly McCarthy was led into the Texas execution chamber, calm, silent, and fully aware that she was moments away from becoming the first black woman executed in America since the return of capital punishment. Her final words had barely left her lips when the lethal injection began, ending a case that gripped the nation for more than 16 years. But how did a former occupational therapist end up strapped to a gurney in one of the most controversial executions of modern history? To answer that, we must go backwards, to a quiet neighborhood in 1997, where an elderly woman opened her door to someone she recognized, someone she trusted, and minutes later she was dead. What followed was a storm of shocking forensic details, disputed evidence, allegations of racial bias, and courtroom battles that created more questions than answers. Tonight, we unravel the crime, the investigation, the trial, and the extraordinary controversy behind her final day. If you love jaw-dropping true crime stories like this, make sure you hit subscribe. You don't want to miss what's coming next. On the morning of February 7, 1997, the suburb of Lancaster, Texas, looked like a postcard, sunlight warming the rooftops, dogs barking in the distance, and the steady rhythm of a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Inside her modest brick home, 71-year-old Dorothy Booth began her day with the quiet grace she was known for. A retired college professor, Dorothy lived alone but was never lonely. Her days were filled with books, volunteer work, phone calls with friends, and a well-practiced morning ritual that started with hot tea and classical music humming through the house. Neighbors described her as the sweetest woman on the street, the type who remembered milestones, baked treats for local kids, and always greeted people with warmth. As the day moved into the calm stillness of the afternoon, Dorothy settled into her usual routine, perhaps preparing lunch, tending to small tasks around the house, or organizing her evening plans. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing hinted that danger was minutes away. Then came a knock at the door, steady and familiar. Dorothy opened it without hesitation because standing there was someone she recognized, her neighbor, Kimberly McCarthy. With a soft tone and a simple request, Kimberly told her she needed to borrow some sugar. It was ordinary, harmless, the kind of suburban moment Dorothy had experienced hundreds of times before, except this time, it marked the beginning of a nightmare. Hours later, when Dorothy didn't answer her phone and missed a scheduled call, concern began to grow. A family member arrived at the house, stepped inside, and immediately sensed something was wrong. The home, usually tidy and peaceful, was in disarray. Drawers were open, items were scattered, and the quiet air felt heavy. Then the discovery: Dorothy Booth's body lay inside her home, the victim of a violent, frenzied attack. She had been stabbed multiple times, the room showing signs of a struggle that must have been terrifying in its intensity. But one detail horrified detectives the moment they saw it. Dorothy's ring finger had been severed, her wedding ring missing, taken with deliberate precision. Forensic investigators flooded the scene, documenting blood patterns, disturbed furniture, and the clear evidence of a burglary intertwined with savage brutality. The finger removal was no accident. It suggested a killer determined to take the ring at any cost. As detectives studied the crime scene, they weighed potential motives. Was this a random burglary that spiraled out of control? A targeted robbery linked to drugs? Or something more personal, someone Dorothy knew and trusted enough to let inside? Their early questions started narrowing when one crucial lead surfaced. Dorothy's credit card had been used shortly after her death, leaving a digital trail investigators followed carefully. That trail led back to a familiar name, Kimberly McCarthy. The detectives had a name. She was a familiar face, a neighbor Dorothy trusted. And as investigators began pulling her history, a fuller, much darker, picture of the woman behind that name started to form. Kimberly LaGale McCarthy was born on May 11, 1961 in Greenville, Texas, a far cry from the violent headlines she later dominated. Her early life, by most accounts, was unremarkable. She grew up in the Dallas area, attended school, and eventually pursued a career helping others. Before her world unraveled, Kimberly actually worked as an occupational therapist in a nursing home, guiding elderly patients through recovery, teaching them to regain strength and mobility. Those who knew her described a woman who, at one time, carried herself with ambition and intelligence. She married Aaron Michaels, a man deeply involved in community and political activism, and together they had one son. For a brief moment, it seemed Kimberly's life was on a stable path: family, career, a future. But beneath that surface, something else was growing, an addiction that slowly consumed every part of her world. In her adulthood, Kimberly developed a severe addiction to crack cocaine, an addiction that drained her finances, altered her relationships, and pushed her toward a cycle of desperation and crime. By 1990, the consequences were no longer avoidable. She was convicted of forgery, a crime tied to her need for quick money. More arrests followed, including charges of prostitution and theft of services, each one pulling her further from the life she once knew and deeper into the grip of a dependency that ruled her decisions. To friends and family, it was clear that the Kimberly they once knew was slipping away. The addiction didn't just take her money, it dismantled every structure in her life. And now, in the aftermath of Dorothy Booth's murder, detectives saw a troubling pattern. A woman struggling with drugs, financial instability, and a history of slipping into criminal behavior when backed into a corner. The first breakthrough in the investigation came not from the crime scene itself, but from the seemingly mundane trail that Dorothy Booth's assailant left behind: her financial transactions. Detectives pored over records from the hours following the murder and discovered that Dorothy's credit card had been used at a series of local pawn shops and retail outlets. At first glance, the purchases seemed ordinary, almost insignificant, until security footage from one of the pawn shops revealed a chilling image. A woman calmly presenting a gold wedding ring that matched the description of Booth's missing jewelry. The video captured her deliberate movements, the careful way she handled the ring, and the measured calm in her demeanor, giving investigators an unnerving sense of premeditation. There was no panic, no hesitation, only control. That woman, unmistakably, was Kimberly McCarthy, a neighbor Dorothy had trusted, a face familiar from years of daily life in the community. In an instant, a pattern began to emerge. This was no random crime of opportunity. Someone had used knowledge of the victim and the neighborhood to carry out a deliberate act. Inside Booth's home, the scene of the murder revealed further evidence that McCarthy had crossed the line from petty crime to violent murder. Forensic teams meticulously cataloged fingerprints, traced DNA, and blood patterns that directly linked McCarthy to key areas of the ransacked living room. Items had been displaced with intention, suggesting a mixture of theft and personal aggression, and investigators noted the precision with which Booth's wedding ring had been removed, a disturbing detail that suggested forethought and cold calculation. Every piece of physical evidence corroborated the financial trail, creating a web of proof that left little doubt in investigators' minds. Kimberly McCarthy had been inside Booth's home, and her actions were deliberate and violent. When McCarthy was brought in for questioning, the tension in the room was palpable. She presented herself calmly, offering explanations and statements that at first seemed plausible, but detectives quickly identified contradictions and inconsistencies. Her account of her whereabouts was fragmented and changed under scrutiny. Her story about the missing ring faltered as evidence was presented, and her demeanor fluctuated between defiance and detachment. Each inconsistency, no matter how small, tightened the net around her and deepened the suspicion that she was hiding far more than petty theft or minor criminal activity. Investigators sensed the presence of a calculating mind, someone accustomed to manipulation and evasion. As the investigation progressed, authorities expanded their scope, quietly examining McCarthy's possible connection to 2 other deaths of elderly women in the area. Though she was never charged in those cases, detectives noted troubling similarities in behavior, method, and opportunity, which suggested a potential pattern. The combined weight of these investigations painted a portrait of an escalating trajectory. A woman who had moved from forgery, theft, and prostitution to violent, calculated murder. For the community, the revelation was staggering. The neighbor they had trusted, whose face had appeared at birthday parties and casual chats over the fence, had transformed into someone capable of cold, deliberate violence. By the time the investigation concluded its initial phase, the evidence was overwhelming. Kimberly McCarthy had not only committed a heinous act against Dorothy Booth, she had crossed a line from which there could be no turning back, setting the stage for one of the most controversial and closely followed criminal cases in Texas history. The courtroom was tense from the moment Kimberly McCarthy entered, her presence commanding attention yet carrying an unsettling calm that seemed almost rehearsed. Media cameras flashed, jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and the air was thick with anticipation as the prosecution prepared to present its case. Prosecutors painted a chilling portrait of McCarthy as a calculated, manipulative killer, someone who leveraged her familiarity with Dorothy Booth to commit a brutal act of violence. They highlighted the forensic evidence, fingerprints, DNA traces, and the meticulously documented sequence of transactions that led from Booth's home to local pawn shops, including the chilling removal of the wedding ring. Each piece of evidence was accompanied by vivid descriptions, photographs, and witness testimony designed to leave the jury with no doubt about her guilt. The narrative was clear. McCarthy had not acted impulsively, she had planned, executed, and attempted to profit from her crime, all while exploiting the trust of her neighbor. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to counter with claims of insufficient evidence and procedural flaws, arguing that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial details and that investigators had overlooked other possibilities. They raised questions about McCarthy's behavior and the reliability of eyewitness accounts, suggesting that the fingerprint and DNA evidence could be coincidental or contaminated. Central to the defense was the argument that racial bias had influenced jury selection, as the predominantly white jury had been carefully scrutinized for potential prejudice, while only one black juror had served, a point that would later fuel appeals and public debate. Yet despite these arguments, the sheer weight of tangible evidence, the credit card trail, pawn shop records, and forensic links, created a formidable case that was difficult for the jury to ignore. As the trial unfolded, emotional testimony punctuated the proceedings. Family members of Dorothy Booth described her warmth, her routines, and the shock of losing someone so beloved to such a violent act. The juxtaposition of Dorothy's quiet, peaceful life against the calculated nature of her death cast a shadow over the courtroom, leaving jurors and observers alike grappling with the enormity of the crime. Throughout the proceedings, McCarthy remained composed, rarely showing overt emotion, a demeanor that some interpreted as defiance, while others saw it as resignation. After days of testimony, cross-examinations, and deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict that echoed through the courtroom and the nation: guilty of capital murder. The decision was accompanied by a sentencing phase in which prosecutors detailed the premeditation, brutality, and greed that had fueled McCarthy's actions, ultimately recommending the death penalty. The judge agreed, formally imposing a sentence of death, setting the stage for years of appeals, legal battles, and national scrutiny. The courtroom left behind a chilling reminder of the consequences of McCarthy's actions. A life lost, a community shaken, and a legal process that would continue to grapple with the questions of justice, race, and the rare execution of a woman in modern America. The walls of the Patrick L. O'Daniel Unit, formerly the Mountain View Unit, Texas's high-security death row, were cold and unyielding, a stark contrast to the life Kimberly McCarthy had once known, a life filled with family, work, and fleeting normalcy. Inside that confined space, McCarthy faced a sentence measured not in days, but in the slow, relentless countdown toward execution. Prison officials described her as quiet but alert, sometimes withdrawn, other times engaging with guards or fellow inmates with surprising clarity, moving through her routines with methodical precision as though preparing herself for the inevitability that hung over her every day. Meanwhile, outside those walls, the case ignited national attention and public outrage. Civil rights groups, including the NAACP and the ACLU, protested the execution, framing it as emblematic of deep flaws in the justice system: racial bias in jury selection, the extraordinary rarity of executing women, particularly black women, and questions about how addiction and personal struggles may have influenced McCarthy's actions. Activists organized demonstrations outside the Walls Unit in Huntsville, launched media campaigns, submitted petitions, and wrote letters to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, urging clemency and highlighting what they saw as inconsistencies and unfairness in her trial. The protests brought the nation's gaze to McCarthy's story, forcing public debate over the intersection of race, gender, and the death penalty. Legal teams filed appeal after appeal, emphasizing procedural errors, jury bias, and the disproportionate application of capital punishment. Each motion brought temporary hope, sometimes delaying the execution, while the community and media dissected every element of the case. McCarthy remained composed during this period, rarely speaking publicly, yet her silence became a focal point for speculation and tension. Was it resignation, defiance, or something more calculated? Inside and outside prison, the case polarized the public. Some saw McCarthy as a cold-blooded killer who deserved the ultimate punishment. Others viewed her as a woman caught at the intersection of systemic injustice and personal tragedy, her execution a symbol of the broader inequities in the criminal justice system. The protests and public debate became part of the story itself, underscoring that this was no ordinary death row case. By the time her final appeals were exhausted, Kimberly McCarthy's fate was sealed, and the nation braced for an execution that would be as historic as it was deeply controversial, leaving behind questions about justice, race, and the rare execution of a woman in modern America. The final day of Kimberly McCarthy's life began at the Patrick L. O'Daniel Unit, where she awoke in near silence, fully aware that the next sunrise would not be hers. Shortly after breakfast, officers informed her it was time. She was escorted, calm, restrained, expression unreadable, to a waiting van for the 40-mile drive to the Huntsville Unit, known as the Walls, where Texas carries out all executions. Outside the red brick building, crowds had already formed. On one side of the street, protesters held signs calling her execution a historic injustice. On the other, supporters of Dorothy Booth's family demanded closure, justice, and accountability. The clash of voices echoed against the walls as the van approached, delivering McCarthy to the place where her life would end. Inside Huntsville, she was placed in a holding cell just steps from the execution chamber. She was visited by her spiritual advisor and legal representatives one final time. There were no special requests for food. Texas eliminated last meal privileges in 2011, meaning her final meal matched what every other inmate received that day. No favorites, no indulgences, just another tray. As the hours slipped away, McCarthy prayed, spoke quietly, and appeared at peace. Guards noted that she remained composed, even gentle, as midnight approached. When the final clearance was given, she was escorted into the brightly lit execution chamber, a cold, clinical room dominated by a single gurney. She lay down, restraints fastened at her wrists and ankles. Witnesses filed in, members of the Booth family, reporters, and selected observers. When asked for her final statement, Kimberly McCarthy lifted her head and spoke clearly, her voice steady, echoing in the silent chamber. "This is not a loss. This is a win. You know where I'm going. I'm going to be home with Jesus. Keep the faith. I love you all." Moments later, the lethal dose of pentobarbital flowed into her veins. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes closed. And at 6:37 p.m. on June 26, 2013, Kimberly McCarthy, at age 52, was pronounced dead, becoming the first black woman executed in the United States since the resumption of capital punishment in 1976. Outside, protesters fell silent. Supporters of the victim embraced. And the nation stood divided, still arguing, still questioning, over a case that blended brutality, addiction, racial tension, and one of the rarest outcomes in American criminal justice. If you were shocked by this story and want to uncover more chilling, jaw-dropping true crime cases from across America, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that exposes the dark, twisted, and unbelievable truths behind some of the most infamous crimes in history. Stay with us because the next case will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice.